Paul McCartney spent decades holding back the truth about a woman who changed everything in his life. In 1968, she walked straight into the Beatles' world like she owned it. She didn't just sit quietly in the background. She touched their instruments, invaded their sacred creative space, and shattered the unspoken rule the band had always lived by: no outsiders. The other Beatles resented her presence instantly. They thought she was strange, disruptive, and too bold. But for Paul, it was worse. His best friend, the man he'd trusted more than anyone, chose her over him, and over the music that had defined their entire lives. Decades later, in 2023, Paul finally confessed the truth. It wasn't just the Beatles that she had broken apart. She had broken his heart in a way that left scars no one could see. And to understand why that hurt cut so deep, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the boy Paul once was, and the world he was born into. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, right in the middle of the most destructive war the world had ever seen. Liverpool wasn't just a city during World War II, it was a target. German planes rained bombs on it night after night because of its docks, its factories, and its importance to Britain's survival. Families like the McCartneys had no choice but to scramble underground, clutching each other in damp shelters as bombs thundered above. His father, Jim, worked in cotton sales while his mother, Mary, was a nurse at Walton Hospital, the very place where Paul entered the world. Their house was dangerously close to the docks, meaning every raid put them directly in harm's way. When Paul was born, his father took one look at him and, in his own awkward attempt at humor, said the baby looked terrible, like a little red piece of meat with one eye open, screaming without stopping. It wasn't the prettiest start, but it was symbolic of the rough life Paul was stepping into. Growing up in a world of blackout curtains, ration books, and nightly sirens gave him a sense of fragility and resilience all at once. By the time Paul was 5 years old, that toughness had already taken root. Childhood in post-war Liverpool wasn't easy. Kids didn't always play fair, and Paul quickly learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to hit back. He remembered once striking another boy with a metal bar and getting publicly scolded in front of the entire school. The humiliation stung, but it also hardened him. Life kept testing him, and he kept pushing back. That spirit carried him into academics, too. When he passed the challenging 11+ exam, he earned a spot at the prestigious Liverpool Institute, a school that was supposed to open doors to opportunity. But if Paul thought his troubles were over, he was wrong. The school itself became another battlefield. His mother was Catholic, his father Protestant, and that difference marked Paul as a target. Many of his classmates from Protestant families bullied him mercilessly. Each day he walked into the building, he knew he'd have to defend himself in one way or another. The bruises weren't just physical, they were emotional. And though he didn't know it at the time, those experiences would seep into his music later on. Songs about resilience, about carrying on through hardship, weren't just lyrics. They were his truth. But nothing in his young life compared to the devastation he faced at just 14 years old. On October 31st, 1956, Paul's mother, Mary, died from breast cancer. She was only 47. She had kept her illness a secret, shielding her sons from the reality that she might not make it. Surgery gave them hope for a moment, but a sudden blood clot ended her life. For Paul, the shock was crushing. His first thought wasn't even about grief. It was about survival. What would they do without her wages? Mary had been the main breadwinner, the steady force that kept the family afloat. And then came the guilt. His last memory of her wasn't tender or sweet. It was him teasing her about the way she said the word ask. That small, silly moment haunted him for the rest of his life. The pain was unbearable, and Paul needed an outlet. A few months later, he wrote his very first song, I Lost My Little Girl, a heartbreaking attempt to put into music the grief he couldn't put into words. That wound would never heal. Years later, when he dreamed of his mother appearing to him, telling him softly that everything would be all right, he turned that dream into one of his most famous songs, Let It Be. To the world, it was a universal anthem of comfort. To Paul, it was his mother's voice. His father, Jim, suddenly had to fill both roles, parent and provider. But Jim was more than a man who worked in sales. He was a musician at heart, someone who understood the language of melody and rhythm without needing sheet music. He played piano and trumpet, and in his younger years he had even worked at the Hippodrome Theatre in Liverpool, running spotlights and soaking in the performances every night. He didn't have formal training. He simply absorbed music by ear, letting it become a part of him. In 1957, he tried to pass that gift on to Paul by giving him a trumpet. Paul was grateful, but he soon ran into a problem. You can't sing and play trumpet at the same time. That realization led him to make a choice that would change the history of popular music forever. He traded the trumpet for a guitar that cost $15. That simple swap opened the door to everything that came after. The guitar allowed Paul to combine his voice with his playing, to create songs that could be built and shared in a way the trumpet never could. Jim's love for old standards, the kind of tunes with strong melodies and simple beauty, seeped into Paul's musical DNA. It shaped his ear for melody, for crafting songs that stuck in people's hearts. Even with school and his budding love for music, Paul couldn't escape the reality of responsibility. By the age of 16, he was working tough, grinding jobs to help his family survive. He delivered coal in the bitter cold mornings, his hands raw from the weight of heavy sacks. He swept floors at a cotton mill where the machines were so loud that thoughts themselves seemed drowned out by the endless roar. These weren't glamorous jobs, but they were lessons. Paul's family had always been working class. His grandfather had spent his days cutting tobacco in a warehouse. His father had labored at the Liverpool Cotton Exchange before moving into sales. Work wasn't optional. It was survival, and Paul carried those experiences with him, even into the music he'd later write. So many Beatles songs that celebrated or honored ordinary life, the struggles, the humor, the pride of working people, came directly from these roots. He wasn't just guessing what that life was like. He had lived it. But in the middle of all this hardship, something happened that nearly ended his story before it even had a chance to begin. In 1952, when Paul was just 10 years old, he and his friends were swimming in one of Liverpool's flooded quarries. To kids, these places looked like fun. Giant pits filled with water, a chance to splash around on a hot day. But they were death traps. The water was freezing cold. The depths full of hidden mining debris, metal and machinery that could snag and drag a child under. Paul slipped beneath the surface, his small body struggling against the weight of the water. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was gone. It was only because his friends pulled him out that he survived. Many other children weren't so lucky in those waters. That brush with death left him shaken, with a fear of swimming that stayed with him for life. But it also sharpened his awareness of how fragile everything was. At just 10 years old, he had already faced the reality that life could be stolen away in an instant. And maybe, just maybe, that knowledge made him more determined to grab hold of every moment that followed. On July 6, 1957, Paul's life changed forever. He wasn't expecting much that day, just another church fete at St. Peter's in Woolton, a small Liverpool suburb. But the sun was out, the music was loud, and fate had plans. Paul wandered over and saw a boy named John Lennon standing on stage with his skiffle band, the Quarry Men. John wasn't polished, not yet. He played with rough, raw energy, using odd chords his mother had shown him. To most of the crowd, it was just another teenage band playing rock and roll. But Paul saw something different. He studied John's hands, his voice, his swagger. And then came Paul's moment. Someone handed him a guitar. But Paul was left-handed. And the guitar wasn't. So he flipped it upside down and stunned everyone by playing Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock flawlessly. Every chord in place, every lyric sung with confidence. He didn't stop there. He ripped into Long Tall Sally like he had been born to do it. The Quarrymen couldn't believe what they were seeing. Here was a kid who could not only play but sing, tune guitars, and knew the hits better than anyone. John had a reputation for being hard to impress, but even he was floored. Right there, in the middle of a churchyard on a summer's day, the two boys who would shake the world met for the very first time. 2 weeks later, one of John's friends, Pete Shotton, spotted Paul riding his bike and casually invited him to join the group. Paul agreed, though he had scout camp and a family holiday to get through first. His first real gig with the Quarrymen came on October 18, 1957. When the band played at a local event, they wore matching jackets, trying to look like a real professional outfit. To Paul, it was surreal. This was the beginning of something bigger, though he couldn't have known just how big it would become. But what made it even more powerful was the timing. Just a few months earlier, John's mother, Julia, had died in a tragic accident. She had been struck by a car and killed instantly. John was left shattered, numb with grief. Paul understood that pain better than anyone. His own mother had died just a year before, and that shared wound, that emptiness only another boy who had lost his mother could truly understand, formed a bond between them that no one else could touch. They didn't need to speak about it all the time. Their music became their language of healing, of connection, of saying the things they couldn't put into words. By 1959, Paul and John were inseparable creatively. They would skip school, sneaking off to Paul's house at 24th Lynn Road, where they sat face to face in his tiny bedroom, guitars in hand, scribbling lyrics into notebooks. They had nothing fancy, just their instruments and a cheap tape recorder. But they had each other, and that was enough. They churned out songs relentlessly, not because anyone asked them to, but because they felt they had to. Their first original song together was called Too Bad About Sorrows, followed by Just Fun, and an instrumental they called Looking Glass. They treated songwriting like a job, even before fame was a possibility. Page after page filled with lyrics and chords. Over 100 songs before the world even knew their names. That discipline, that work ethic, was the foundation of what would later make them unstoppable. But even with their talent and determination, not everything came easy. Paul learned that lesson the hard way during his very first gig with the Quarrymen. He had one task: play the guitar solo on Guitar Boogie. He had practiced it endlessly over and over until his fingers ached. But when the spotlight hit and the crowd stared, his nerves betrayed him. His mind went blank. His fingers stumbled. The solo fell apart in a mess of missed notes. The humiliation was crushing. Paul, who prided himself on precision, wanted to quit right then and there. He thought maybe he wasn't cut out for this. But instead of giving up, he made a decision. If he couldn't be a lead guitarist, he'd find another way. That realization paved the way for something extraordinary. Because when George Harrison joined the band in early 1958, Paul gladly stepped aside to let George take the lead guitar role. And that single choice, born from failure, gave the group one of the greatest lead guitarists rock would ever know. Sometimes losing one role is what allows you to find your true one. For Paul, that lesson stuck. George's arrival shifted everything. He was younger than John and Paul, but brimming with talent. His quiet focus and natural skill on the guitar balanced John's rebellious energy and Paul's perfectionist drive. With George in the mix, the Quarrymen began to feel less like a group of kids and more like the early stages of something real. For Paul, it meant he could focus on his strength, songwriting, harmonies, and the kind of playing that glued the music together. It was the beginning of the chemistry that would later define the Beatles: John's edge, Paul's melody, and George's precision, all intertwined. But in those early days, it was still rough, still uncertain. They weren't legends yet. They were just teenagers in Liverpool, dreaming of something bigger than themselves, working through grief, failure, and fragile hope, building piece by piece the bond that would one day change music forever. Paul's life began to shift in ways he never could have imagined when a boy named John Lennon entered the picture. At first glance, John wasn't the type of person Paul's family would have approved of: rebellious, sharp-tongued, and with an energy that bordered on chaotic. But beneath that rough exterior, Paul recognized something extraordinary. John had an edge, a wit, and a vision that perfectly balanced Paul's melodic instincts. When the two first played together, something clicked immediately. Their bond wasn't built on polite friendship, but on a kind of creative collision. They pushed each other, challenged each other, and sometimes even frustrated one another, but together they were unstoppable. Paul would later admit that John was like a brother to him, someone who understood his mind in a way no one else could. Their partnership became the foundation of what would soon transform the world of music forever. And yet, no one at the time, not even Paul himself, could have predicted just how far those first moments of strumming, guitars together in dusty Liverpool rooms, would take them. It Wasn't just John and Paul, though, there. Were other players who stepped into the story, names that would go on to become legends in their own right. George Harrison, still just a teenager, was brought into the fold, his talent undeniable despite his young age. Then came Ringo Starr, whose steady drumming and personality gave the group a balance they hadn't even realized they were missing. The Beatles, as the world would come to know them, weren't just a band. They were a storm waiting to happen. Paul often reflected that it was almost magical how they all found each other in the gritty working-class city of Liverpool. Every member brought something unique: John's sharpness, George's quiet brilliance, Ringo's humor and rhythm, and Paul's ear for melody. Together they created a sound that wasn't just music, it was electricity. Still, in those early days, they were just kids trying to make their way, lugging heavy equipment from gig to gig, playing in dingy clubs for audiences that barely paid attention. Fame wasn't guaranteed. In fact, rejection was far more common than acceptance. But Paul, even in those moments, carried that burning desire to rise above, the same one that had been ignited back when he lost his mother. He wasn't about to let go of the dream now. Those early performances weren't glamorous. The Beatles spent endless nights in places like Hamburg, Germany, where they played for hours on end in smoky bars filled with sailors, drunks, and rowdy crowds. Hamburg was grueling, but it was also where they sharpened their skills. Paul would later say that Hamburg made them into the band they became. They played until their fingers bled, until their voices cracked, and until exhaustion pulled at every part of them. But in that crucible of noise, chaos, and cheap beer, they learned how to control an audience, how to connect with people, and how to keep going even when the odds seemed stacked against them. Paul thrived in that environment. His work ethic, his discipline, and his hunger kept him going. He was no stranger to hardship, and Hamburg only proved to him that the dream was worth every sacrifice. For all its hardships, those nights gave the Beatles the kind of experience no classroom could teach. They returned to England not just as a group of musicians, but as a tight-knit force with the kind of confidence that would soon set them apart. And then, seemingly overnight, everything began to change. With Brian Epstein taking on the role of their manager, the Beatles suddenly had structure. They traded in their rough leather jackets for tailored suits, their long, chaotic sets for polished performances. Paul, in particular, understood the importance of presentation. He embraced Epstein's vision, seeing it as the key to reaching beyond the dingy clubs and into the hearts of millions. The band began to attract attention, their catchy songs and undeniable charisma making them stand out in a crowded music scene. But while they were finding success, Paul knew they had to push further. He became increasingly meticulous, often obsessing over every note, every harmony, every lyric. His perfectionism sometimes caused tension within the group, especially with John, who preferred rawness over polish. But that friction, between Paul's drive for precision and John's hunger for authenticity, was exactly what made their music so groundbreaking. Together, they were crafting songs that weren't just catchy tunes, but works of art that captured the mood of a generation. Yet with every step forward, Paul also felt the weight of expectation grow heavier. He wasn't just another band member. He was becoming the backbone of the group, the one who kept pushing, the one who refused to settle. The others noticed it too. Ringo would often say that Paul was the one who could never stop working, who always had another idea, another melody, another way to make a song better. That intensity drove the band to new heights, but it also planted the seeds of conflict. Paul's vision for what the Beatles could be sometimes clashed with the others' desires for freedom or simplicity. And while fans adored the group's music, none of them could see the battles being waged behind closed doors. For Paul, it was never just about fame. It was about proving something to himself, to his late mother, and perhaps even to the world that had underestimated a boy from Liverpool. Each step they took toward global superstardom wasn't just success, it was survival. It was legacy. It was Paul refusing to ever go back to the life of loss and struggle he had known as a child. The moment Beatlemania exploded, Paul's life, and the lives of his bandmates, changed forever. One day, they were just four young men from Liverpool playing music they loved, and the next, they were at the center of a cultural phenomenon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Crowds of screaming fans followed them everywhere. Airports, hotels, and entire city blocks were shut down just for a glimpse of the Beatles. And at the heart of that hysteria was Paul, with his boyish charm, warm smile, and effortless charisma. To millions of young fans, he wasn't just a musician. He was the symbol of a new generation, a beacon of energy and hope in a world still recovering from the weight of wars and old traditions. But what looked glamorous from the outside often felt overwhelming from within. Paul once admitted that the screaming was so loud at concerts that the band couldn't even hear themselves play. What the fans saw as magic was, for Paul, a whirlwind of noise, exhaustion, and endless responsibility. The weight of fame was suffocating at times. While the world adored them, Paul and the others were essentially trapped in a cycle of constant touring, interviews, and performances. Privacy became a luxury they could no longer afford. Paul, who had always been grounded by his family roots, found himself struggling with the isolation that came with fame. No matter where they went, they were never truly alone. Security, handlers, and press surrounded them constantly. Still, Paul made an effort to keep a sense of normalcy. He often reached out to fans, gave warm interviews, and carried himself with a grace that made him approachable despite the madness around him. His natural charm kept the Beatles relatable, even when they seemed larger than life. Yet beneath that exterior, Paul was beginning to feel the strain. He carried the pressure of not only being a performer, but also being one of the primary songwriters, constantly expected to deliver the next hit that would keep the machine moving forward. And deliver he did. Some of the most iconic songs in the Beatles' early years bore Paul's unmistakable touch. Yesterday, written almost entirely by Paul, showed the world that the Beatles were more than just a pop act. They were serious musicians capable of timeless artistry. Paul's ability to weave melody and emotion into music set him apart, even within a band of geniuses. But with success came resentment, and Paul's increasing dominance in the studio sometimes rubbed John the wrong way. Their partnership, once perfectly balanced, began to shift. John had always been bold and daring, but Paul's discipline and drive often gave him the final say on projects. While this tension sparked brilliance, it also created cracks that would later widen into rifts. Still, in those years, Paul seemed unstoppable. He was not only thriving as a songwriter, but also as a performer, captivating audiences with every note, every smile, and every moment of stage presence. Yet Paul's story during this time wasn't just about music. It was about carrying an identity that had become bigger than himself. The Beatles weren't just entertainers. They had become symbols of cultural change. The hairstyles, the fashion, even their opinions began to influence millions around the world. Paul, with his articulate manner and optimistic outlook, became one of the most visible spokesmen of the group. He wasn't just singing songs, he was speaking for a generation. That kind of power is intoxicating, but it also comes with a cost. Paul knew that every word, every decision, every step he took was being watched, scrutinized, and judged. For someone who had once been just a boy from Liverpool grieving his mother, the scale of that responsibility was staggering. And yet he carried it with remarkable poise, rarely letting the cracks show, always striving to live up to the expectations of fans, of his bandmates, and of himself. But as the heights grew higher, so too did the shadows grow darker. The demands of constant success were unrelenting, and Paul began to sense the fragility of it all. He knew the world adored the Beatles, but he also knew that fame is fleeting, that music trends change, and that public adoration can vanish as quickly as it arrives. Perhaps that awareness is what pushed him even harder in the studio, what drove him to obsess over arrangements and harmonies long after the others had gone home. He wasn't just chasing hits. He was chasing immortality, the kind of legacy that couldn't be erased by time or changing tastes. And though the cracks within the band were widening, Paul refused to let the dream slip away. The Beatles weren't just a band to him. They were the proof of everything he had fought for since that dark day when he lost his mother. He couldn't let it fall apart, at least not yet.